We are back after a week off. Good to be on board here on Giants.com as well as the mobile app.
We're back, Lance.
So I could tell you're jumping
We are
through
back.
Indeed.
I feel like a bull in a china shop.
Well, let's try to keep the equipment in one piece, shall we?
You know down in Spain when they have the Matador?
Sure.
The Matador? No,
Yeah.
the Matador with the red cape, and he's waving it, and the bull is like, he's like chomping at the bit, and he can't wait to run through the red cape?
Yes.
That's how I feel after a week off. Let's go.
You really should do a better job in showcasing your emotions. You seem to be keeping it all in.
We're back, fellas.
Yes.
And ladies and children, we are back.
Hey, there's multiple ways you can interact with us here on the program. 201-939-4513. Hashtag Giants Chat. A reminder, you can find the archive of this show and our entire podcast network on the Giants mobile app, podcast platforms everywhere, and at Giants.com/podcast. So we're going to continue our opponent preview series. Later on in the program, we will break down the Seattle Seahawks, Week 4 opponent, Monday Night Football. But in the meantime, we'll tackle a few other topics. And interestingly, Paul, CBS Sports did an exercise where they have an X Factor listed for all 32 teams in the NFL. And what they mean by X Factor is it's not necessarily a player. It could be a head coach, it could be a position group, it could be a general manager. There's a variety of different directions that they went on with respect to each team. But let's focus on the Giants. And then it's also interesting to see what they chose for the rest of the division in the NFC East. And I don't think it's a surprise who they chose for the Giants. I mean, you figured they'd probably go in the direction of one of the new arrivals, but I think it could be debated whether or not this is the true X factor or there are other stronger candidates. And they ultimately landed on Darren Waller, which was obviously the big splash move for the Giants this offseason, acquiring him from the Raiders. I just want to read you what they wrote, small paragraph that they did for each team. Quote, the Giants were able to craft even a remotely efficient offense last season with their passing game weapons was a pretty incredible feat accomplished by Brian Dable and Mike Kafka. Being able to do it again was going to be extremely difficult, so they at least tried to make a moderate upgrade to the skill position group. Waller was the biggest swing among that group, and he's only 2 years removed from having gone 90 receptions, 1,145 receiving yards, and 3 touchdowns, and then, of course, 107, 1,196, and 9 the following season. He's only played 20 of 34 games over the past 2 years, though he has combined for 83 receptions for over 1,000 yards and 5 touchdowns during that time. He'll turn 31 years old early in the season. How much is left in the tank will determine whether he could be a true alpha passing option for Daniel Jones, which the Giants probably need him to be. So they're looking at him, if he stays healthy, puts up his numbers from a few years ago, that he could truly put his stamp on this offense this season.
Well, how many times have we talked about the fact that he's a 2-time 1,000-yard receiver in this league, and those guys don't grow on trees? The Giants were very fortunate. And in all honesty, it's because of Andy Bischoff, their tight ends coach, who had him in Baltimore when he first got into the league with the Ravens. When Joe Shane had the opportunity, understanding that Waller was available on the market, he asked Coach Bischoff, he's like, come on, give me the background on this guy. What do you think? And Bischoff went bonkers. It's like, we've got to get him. Absolutely, double thumbs up, 5 stars. Don't even hesitate. And so Shane went and made the deal. I think that is one of those instances, one of those examples, if you will, where it really helps to have cooperation between the staff. So that, Joe had absolutely no hesitation once Bischoff said full speed ahead, man, you got to get him. Well, they got him. And now it's going to be up to the guy to stay healthy and obviously put up the kind of numbers that the Giants acquired him for.
And we've seen that when they've brought in former Buffalo Bills players. Clearly,
no doubt.
You have familiarity there.
Look
so it's
what
no
Hodgins
different.
did.
Yeah.
When there's one really good thing about having those spiderweb connections around the league, and that is you can uncover under the radar guys who, for some reason or another, and it could be a variety of different factors, the guy didn't necessarily break out and put his name on the map. With Hodgins, it was injury, and it was depth chart.
Sure.
Right? With Waller, it was injury. Ashawn Robinson, he's a lower-level name on a defense that had guys like Ramsey and had guys like Donald, among others, on a very high-profile defense. So you get a guy like Ashawn Robinson, who is a steady, hard worker, really helps stuff the run, and you say to yourself, hey, you know what? this guy's going to be really good for us. He can be impactful. He doesn't have to play 60 snaps a game. He can only play 20, 25, and he's really going to enhance our defense. And so that's how you kind of filter through these guys. And, the Giants are hoping that they've got a bunch of those kinds of guys who will produce for them where maybe they hadn't necessarily become household names for other teams in the past.
Well, and it goes back to, like you said, more of an opportunity on this roster as opposed to their previous stops. Though A'Shawn Robinson's been on a few teams prior to the Rams. I mean, he was with the Lions. So, yeah. I think at this point in his career, you know what you're getting out of him. He understands his role and so forth. But Hodgins is a much better example because there's somebody that was hurt and was buried on the depth chart. And then I'll even throw Nick McLeod as another guy, Paul.
No doubt.
Who also has a Buffalo connection, right? I mean, how much was he playing?
How about Paris Campbell?
Paris Campbell, too, though he is coming off a career year in Indianapolis, so finally got on the field.
But they do have coaching connections to the Colts.
100%. And it's no different than we see with other NFL teams, right? You're going to lean on players that you know of or that your coaching staff knows of because you just feel a little bit more secure. I go back to, and this has been something that Joe Schoen has brought up a lot with respect to free agency versus the draft versus retaining your own players. Mm-hmm. And he mentioned you always want to try to retain your own players more so than the other two facets because you're operating with better intel as opposed to right, bringing in a player who has no connection to the roster, no connection to the front office. You could collect, Paul, as much evidence as possible, but at the end of the day, you don't know for sure how they're going to fit in. If you see what a player did, like an Isaiah Hodgins, a year within your facility, he produced. Of course, they have to warrant a second contract. I'm not saying you sign a guy just because he was here, but I think it makes you feel a little bit more confident that you're not rolling the dice as much as you are with a rookie coming in from college or a veteran even in free agency, but you have not been exposed to that player.
Now, that only works if the staff members that you're talking about have legitimate objective evaluations, and they know that that guy has something to bring to the table. We have seen other players come in from other teams where staff members had been before, and they didn't have anything left, and they didn't work out so well. So it's not an automatic. Sure. Just because you have someone on the staff who's connected to the player, we're going to bring him in, and he's going to work out and be good for you. Not always the case. Those staff members have to be able to put their neck on the line and say, you know what? I know he's got something to give us. It is worth reaching out and bringing him in. And you better be right because, again, I'm not going to name names here, but there have been staff members on previous coaching staffs here who reached out, helped bring guys in from other teams, and they did not have much to offer. And it was simply because maybe those coaches just had a comfort zone with those players, and they weren't truly evaluating the talent and what they may have brought to the team. They were simply, I know that guy. I'm comfortable with him. Let me have him in my room. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not a good thing.
Or they just felt comfortable having another veteran voice in the room, right, to help mentor some of the younger guys, which is fine on the surface. But when you're talking about a 53-man roster and every position is so critical, you can't necessarily be giving away roster spots for guys that just basically serve as an extension of the coaching staff.
Well, look at what happened with Hottie Ward. Came from Baltimore. Yep. I know he had a stopover in Jacksonville, but really came from Baltimore because of Wink Martindale.
And several other guys that he brought over.
Let's not kid ourselves. He was an impactful player last year, albeit a part-time player, a rotational player, did not play like 90% of the snaps. He was a rotational player, but he had an effect on this team. He helped them win.
Sure, and it's okay if you bring in one or two guys that you think can help smooth out the transition of your scheme. It doesn't hurt from that standpoint, and that's why I don't think it's any coincidence that a number of Buffalo Bills came over last year, whether it be on offense or defense, simply because Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen and a number of the assistants, too, that came over with Brian Daboll, they knew that those players, I think it was a matter of you want to build an identity, Paul, in year one. And maybe there's a little bit more value to bringing in players, even if there's not an overwhelming amount of gas in the tank. And I'm not saying that there was an example of a player who was more on the end of the line, but I think there's a little bit more leeway because it's year one. When you're in year 2 and year 3 and you're looking to make progress as a team, I don't think you have as much flexibility to take a flyer on a guy like that.
We were so concerned going into last season about Saquon Barkley coming off another injury that I don't ever remember anyone in the media corps asking Barkley about how much Matt Breida helped him adapt to the Buffalo Bills offense.
Sure.
And the kinds of things that both Dable and Kafka wanted this offense to do. I don't ever remember that question being asked.
No, and I don't think he brought it up himself either.
No, but I know what a pro Breida is. I've gotten to know him.
Yep.
And he is a pro's pro, without question. I would have to believe, even if it was in the back of their minds and it wasn't on the forefront, it was simply osmosis, I have to believe that Breida's presence did help Barkley some in his first year under the new system.
I think that's fair. Plus, he had some flash plays here or there when his number was called out of the backfield, too. But I think, just to extend my point earlier, having those guys set an example of how you practice, getting comfortable with the scheme for a Saquon Barkley, that does help in year one, I think, more so than anything else.
Sure.
It may not have as much value as now all the players who weren't in the scheme now know what Kafka and Dable are going to run. But right out of the gates, the first training camp, I do think that holds some extra substance from that standpoint.
Speaking of training camp, by the way, folks, the covered bleachers are out and around the sidelines at the Giants grass practice facility out in the parking lot. Things are starting to look like Christmas, baby.
Yeah, it's amazing. Before we were here, before we took our break, they were in the process of putting them up, and now you see the finished product once you come back. They should actually, I'm wondering whether or not our production team shot the entire process as I look over on the opposite side. No, that wasn't. Well, I mean, listen, you guys and gals do enough. I was just throwing out another idea if they wanted to put up a video.
I know what a good worker Dom is. I think he was actually out there with the wrench and the screwdriver and the nuts and the bolts.
So he was actually putting up the stands.
He was trying to help them out.
Well, then somebody else, like a good team, should then have taken grasp of the camera if he's then taking on another role.
Maybe Pearson did that. Or he was putting up the canopy over the bleachers. I'm not sure.
There you go. Yeah. Dom was putting up the stands. Pearson was putting up the canopy. There we go. We got to the bottom of it. We have solved the riddle here on Giants.com. But in all seriousness, Darren Waller, in terms of X Factor, and I know I read the blurb that CBS had published, you figure what he will do for other players and the matchup challenges that he will present for the opposition makes him a very strong candidate from that lens to be an X Factor. But I think it's interesting to throw out maybe other candidates. I don't know if I would put a wide receiver in the conversation. And the reason being is I think there's depth, there's volume, there's substance. That I don't know if one guy in particular, Paul, I would say holds the label of X Factor. If anything, I think Waller will do more of the heavy lifting for the receiving core than vice versa. So I wouldn't put a wide receiver in this conversation.
I have been on the record as saying I don't think there'll be a 1,000-yard receiver on this team other than tight end Darren Waller, and I'm sticking with that. And I've got no problem with that. I think the Giants can be very successful under that formula. That doesn't mean there won't be a receiver or two that catches 700 yards worth or 800 yards worth, but I don't think there'll be a 1,000-yard guy strictly on the boundary. I will say for me, and I know you mentioned to me, it wasn't just a player question. It was also about units, front office, coaches, et cetera, et cetera. For me, I still think it comes down to if the Giants' offensive line plays as well as they believe it will, they're going to be in very, very good shape this year. I think all of the other positions, yes, I know they had to upgrade the rush defense, and they've added Bobby Okereke as a middle linebacker. They've added the 2 defensive linemen to help out there.
Sure.
They've added a couple of guys in the secondary. I get all of those things. But ultimately, if Neal comes off of his rookie season healthy and advances his game, if John Michael Schmitz is as pro-ready as they think he is, and Joshua Azudu is ready to take the next step in his healthy sophomore season, all of a sudden, this offensive line, whatever rankings you want to go by, I still think there's a lot more talent on that line than a lot of people are giving it credit for. But all of a sudden, a lot of those rankings that you're seeing around the country are going to take a big jump skyward. I think I've seen a lot of people say they're in the bottom 5 or 6 of the National Football League by most people's NFL rankings, offensive line-wise. I disagree with that. I think the Giants have the talent on their potential starting 5 to easily be a middle-of-the-pack offensive line, and who knows what the ceiling could possibly be down the road. But I think this year in 2023, I think this is going to be right there. There'll be a middle-of-the-pack offensive line that is not going to hurt them in terms of doing things that they want to do.
Well, the big test will be, it goes without saying, who they play within the division because of the fierce defensive fronts of the pass
they'll be
rushers.
tested.
But I would argue it's also what happens outside of the division this year because the schedule is
no
a bit
doubt
more challenging too. So I would not look at it just in the NFC East bubble. When you look at some of the defensive fronts that the Giants are going to see this season, which has no relation to the NFC East, you're going to see San Francisco. And the Niners, we know, have some big boys that could bring pressure to the quarterback. We're going to be breaking down the Seahawks. I think the Seahawks have several underrated guys specifically that are coming off of career years. The Dolphins have an electric secondary, and that could provide a big boost for what the Dolphins' defensive front could do. Buffalo has had a very strong track record in that department. So, there's 4 straight teams, Paul, that you're going to see between weeks 3 and 6, which is going to test your offensive line. And I didn't even bring up one NFC East team out of that group. So I think it goes beyond, can you handle the Micah Parsons of the world,
no
the
doubt.
Daron Paynes, and everything that the Eagles have to throw out.
I'm going to add something here that we haven't really talked a lot about during the last few months, and it's almost surprising to say that because we've exhausted every topic. But I will say this. We discussed last summer how the Giants' offensive playbook was very varied. There were so many creative things that they were showing. And then they didn't show a whole ton of it during the season. I think part of that was because the wide receivers room was not what they were hoping it would be. I think part of that was the offensive line's pass protection was very sporadic. They had a few injuries that clearly impacted the pass protection and may have, in all honesty, may have forced them to swallow chapters in the playbook.
It's possible.
I believe that because I saw so many things last summer that never made it into a game. I'm going to say now that they're in year 2 of the offense, they've upgraded the offensive line. They've upgraded the wide receiver room. They've upgraded the receiving capabilities at the tight end position. Again, no disrespect to Bellinger. I have to believe we're going to see a lot more of those chapters start coming out of the woodwork this year. This is going to be a dramatically improved offense. And I've gone on record as saying it would not surprise me if they can score 24 points a game. It really would not. 23, 24 a game. That would not surprise me.
Well, they were at that 21.5 barometer last season.
And it's asking a lot for an NFL team to jump up by a field goal. I don't think that's unrealistic for this team.
No, we've seen teams make that jump, so I would agree with you. I don't think that's asking for much. I think when people start throwing out a touchdown difference, that's when you're not being
That's a lot.
realistic.
That's a lot.
That we have not seen, even if you go back to recent or past NFL history, unless you're bringing in a completely new staff and a completely new roster from top to bottom. And we know there's continuity with respect to the Giants. But could they improve by 3 points? I'm completely with you, Paul. I think a lot of it has to do with them maintaining that red zone efficiency. And part of that was the ability to run the football effectively. I know the emphasis is on some of the new weapons in the passing game, but let's not lose track of the fact that the Giants need to be able to run the ball just as effectively. And I'm talking about in the red zone. I'm not talking about overall. It's all about timing and situational football. Can you finish when you're inside the 20? That was an issue in previous seasons. Last year, we saw a better rate of being able to finish. And in fairness, we also saw a defensive group that did a really good job keeping opponents out of the end zone. Those are two things as to why I think the Giants played a lot of close games and were in it more often than not.
No doubt. And I'm sure that they want those same advantages this year. Just because we think they've done some tweaking and the Giants want to be a, quote, better overall team, I'm sure that if you were to sit down Kafka and Martindale, the two coordinators of offense and defense in this room right now, Martindale would say, I still want to win red zone and I still want to win third down. And as long as he gets to win those two, and of course, again, we've talked about this too, quarterback pressures, the combination of sacks, hurries, and hits equals pressures.
Yep.
Giants were easily a top 10 team in the league last year in quarterback pressures. Martindale wants those numbers to remain consistent and then enhance some of the others. Same thing on the other side for Kafka. The Giants were a much better team in the red zone last year. They were a much better team in running the football last year. He's going to want those things to remain consistent and then add additional explosive plays to the equation.
And that's why I bring that up, because whenever we talk about NFL teams, it's almost just assumed or taken for granted that everything's going to carry over from last season. And that doesn't happen. So that's the key. You need to make sure that foundation is still with you. Then you add on top of that with some of the new faces. I want to just run through, before we have our guest on to break down the Seahawks, the other teams in the NFC East and what CBS looks at as their X factor. So for the Cowboys, they went with Brandon Cooks, who is also their big splash addition this offseason. Remember, they lost Amari Cooper to the Cleveland Browns. So here's a vertical threat, polished veteran who has made an impact on just about every team that he has gone to. It's kind of crazy how many times Brandon Cooks has been traded during the course of his career. I don't think I've ever seen somebody in his stature, right, move around so much. But they point to him teaming up with C.D. Lamb and Michael Gallup, providing a nice trio of wide receivers. I think that's a very strong candidate when you look at that Cowboys roster.
I would not argue. I think that's certainly a very logical selection.
Now, as far as the Philadelphia Eagles are concerned, as I move down my list, they actually went with, and this is an interesting choice, they went with offensive coordinator Brian Johnson. Because remember, the Eagles lost both of their coordinators to new head coaching gigs, Shane Steichen going over to the Indianapolis Colts. Now, Johnson is an in-house promotion, so they're not bringing in a new voice. There's somebody that knew the offense as their QB coach. Whenever a new play caller takes over, I get it. But Nick Sirianni, to me, is still going to be heavily involved in the play calling. So I don't look at Brian Johnson as the end-all, be-all X factor. To me, I think it's more of, actually, I would go so far to say, Jalen Hurts. You know, can he duplicate what he did last season? I think he's a stronger candidate for that. And then on the defensive side of the ball, they did lose some personnel. So does the defensive front, do you get as much rotation when you've lost a Hargrave, for example, who went over to San Francisco? Not to say that I don't think they have the pieces, but that was a great luxury for Philadelphia. I would go more in the direction of that than I would go in the direction of their new offensive coordinator.
I would concur, and then quite honestly, if I had to go a second guy, I would just say a unit. I'm curious to see how their running back unit works out without Sanders.
Sure.
I mean,
there is some carryover from the guys on the depth chart.
Gainwell's a really good back.
Yep. And Boston Scott, who has hurt the Giants.
Don't even talk to me about that guy. I'm just
bringing up the facts here as we're talking about, but go ahead.
My God, he beats one team in the league every year, and then the rest of the league has a feast against him. But Gainwell can play, and then obviously they added the veteran back. They added the Eagles
from the Seahawks. You're talking about?
Yes, Penny, right?
Rashad Penny. Yes.
So, he's had a lot of injuries. So what is their running game going to look like? Obviously, it's going to be more by committee than it's been in the past when Sanders, had over 1,000 yards last year. So I'm curious. I'm curious about how will Hurts respond to his career year, and how will that running game support him?
No, I think all fair points. I look at the fact that the Eagles, this is not their first rodeo when they rely on multiple backs. So I think that, God forbid, one of those guys goes down, I think they'll be able to survive that.
You know what stinks? They still got the line, they still got the tight end, and they still got the receivers.
Well, hey, that's how you build the foundation, Paul.
They're still the best roster in the conference. Yeah. They really are.
And we'll get into more with respect to Washington, but they chose Eric Bieniemy as the X factor, and I think you make a much stronger case for Bieniemy in Washington than Brian Johnson in Philadelphia. And we'll get into more of that as we move forward here on Giants.com. Big Blue Kickoff Live, Monday's edition, as we have been catching up with some time off following last week. You can tell Paul is already jumping through hoops as he is ultimately excited to get back into the conversation. So we're going to continue our opponent preview series, and today we're turning our attention to the Seattle Seahawks, as the Giants are going to host the Seahawks on Monday Night Football in Week 4. And to help break down the Seahawks, we are now joined by Dave Softy Mahler, who is a host on KJR Radio in Seattle. Dave, you got Lance Medow, Paul Dottino here on Big Blue Kickoff Live. Greatly appreciate the time. Hope all is well. How's everything on your end?
Everything is great. Paulie, great to hear your voice and be back on the radio show. I want to just remind you guys that MetLife Stadium is my second favorite stadium in the NFL behind Lumen Field, and for obvious reasons, because the Seahawks won their only championship there 10 years ago. How about that? 10 years ago. My God, time's flying.
Yeah, that is a long time. Hey, you know what, Softy? Always good to talk to you. And by the way, you know, your listeners who really gave me a hard time last year because I was down on that one Geno Smith, and I will ask you about him in a moment, but just make sure your listeners know that last year the Giants made the playoffs and won a wild card game, unlike the Seahawks, who got basically thrashed in their wild card game. Just make sure they're aware of that, okay?
All right. Well, first of all, for those that don't know, let me just remind people, Paul came on the air and was minimizing the Seahawks, poo-pooing Geno Smith, blah, blah, blah. And then they beat the Giants in Seattle. And you're right, the Giants had a better year technically than the Seahawks did, but the Giants were supposed to have a better year than the Seahawks were last year. The Seahawks were supposed to stink. The Seahawks were not supposed to be 9-8 and make the playoffs. The Seahawks were supposed to be awful. And instead it turned out to be Denver and Russell Wilson who were awful. That's the kind of year the Seahawks were supposed to have. And instead the Broncos had that kind of year. So I think if we're being honest with each other and we're looking at this with the proper context, Paulie,
yes,
you go back
Softy,
and look at last year and you think that Pete Carroll, I'm telling you, that was one of the best coaching jobs of Pete Carroll's career, what he did with that football team and that quarterback a year ago.
Now, don't slight the coach of the year, Brian Daboll, okay? Because no one had the Giants making the playoffs either. But, Softy, let me get back to the question that needs to be asked. Geno Smith, one of the most miraculous late blooming stories in the history of quarterbacks in the NFL, or was that an aberration? And does he come back to being the quarterback that all New York football fans know he is?
Well, if you go back and look at his splits from the first half to the second half, it's almost like Geno Smith turned into a pumpkin in the second half of the year, right? The clock struck midnight and Geno Smith turned back into a pumpkin because he did not play great in the second half of the year. He played okay in the second half. He played really well in the first half of the year and okay in the second half of the year, which, you know what? I would have been fine with that because I think this football team, even now, they need to rely on their running game with Kenny Walker and Zach Charbonnet, the rookie out of UCLA. They need to rely on their defense with Bobby Wagner back after a one-year hiatus with the LA Rams. I don't think that Geno Smith is still the type of quarterback that you can say, hey, go win us a championship, go win us a division title. And I think the NFC West is really a two-team race between the Niners and the Seahawks, guys. I think the Cardinals are going to stink. I think the Rams are going to stink. I think the NFC itself is wide freaking open. It's anybody's conference this season, so it's going to be wild to see who comes out of the NFC to go to the Super Bowl. But I still think Geno Smith is a complimentary quarterback to the rest of the football team. And guess what? I think the Seahawks agree with that. That's why they went out and made all the adjustments they made to their defensive front. They got Draymond Jones from Denver. They brought back Jaron Reed in free agency. They brought back Bobby Wagner. They took a corner at number 5, third highest drafted secondary player of all time in the history of the franchise behind Sean Springs and Kenny Easley. So they knew they needed to upgrade this football team at a lot of positions if they're serious about winning in the NFC, and I thought they did that over the offseason.
One other name that I want to bring up, you were talking about the job that Pete Carroll did. I think Shane Waldron, their offensive coordinator, Dave, deserves a lot of credit too. And also the fact that people forget, Geno, while last year was a career year, he was the backup to Russell Wilson in 2021. So he was exposed to the offense, which I think he benefited from because it wasn't as if he was walking in to a brand new scheme. What have the dynamics been like between Geno and Shane Waldron? And really, I look at this as year 3 of them together. And how much do you think that could very well help him just pick up where he left off, essentially?
Well, it's huge. And here's the other part of this whole thing, you know, all the intangibles that guys like us don't really talk about. Geno Smith is beloved in that locker room, like really, really well respected by a lot of people in the locker room. And they went out and got Drew Lock in the Russell Wilson trade. And if they would have given Drew Lock the starting quarterback job without letting Geno Smith begin training camp as the number one guy, there would have been a freaking mutiny inside that locker room last year, because those guys really, really like Geno. They really, really respect him. He's a hardworking guy, never rocks the boat, plays whatever role the Seahawks want him to play, and he's benefited from that. So you're right. The fact that he was able to sit back and watch this offense for the last couple of years, I mean, you guys got to remember, Brian Schottenheimer in the first 8 games of 2020 during the COVID season, these guys were rocking. They were clicking. They were averaging over 30 points a game, and they were 6-2. And then all of a sudden, the offense kind of fell apart. The team kind of fell apart, and they lost at home to the Rams in the first round in front of no fans at Lumen Field. And they fired the offensive coordinator and Brian Schottenheimer after having a pretty good year offensively, statistics-wise. So they went out and got Shane Waldron, who was a really kind of unknown guy from the Rams organization. And guys, you got to remember, whoever the offensive coordinator is in Seattle is a freaking huge deal. He's the head coach of the offense because Pete Carroll is a defensive-minded guy. Yes, Pete Carroll every now and then will stick his hand in the cookie jar and try to, put his imprints on the offensive side of the ball. Run the ball this, run the ball that. We can talk about that famous play in Phoenix, Arizona, 9 years ago, but I prefer not to. If you guys appreciate that, we can just skip that one. But the point is, whoever the offensive coordinator is has a major, major role with this football team. He's the second most important coach on the staff because he's the head coach of the offense, because Pete Carroll's a defensive-minded guy.
Well, if either Geno Smith or if Walker are going to have the kind of years that the Seahawks need from them, this young but experienced offensive line is going to have to do the job. What is your assessment of what they can expect, Softy?
Right. Well, I love what Charles Cross and Abe Lucas did as rookies at right and left tackle, guys. It's not very often that you see a team start for 17 weeks, a rookie at right tackle and a rookie at left tackle, and that's what they went out and did with Charles Cross and Abe Lucas. So I think those guys are now ahead of the curve because of what they did a year ago. They got a center from Michigan, okay? He's the Outland Trophy winner in Olu Oluwatimi. We call him Big Olu. From Michigan.
I like him, Softy.
5th round.
I like him.
Yeah, a lot of people think this guy might be a giant steal for the Seahawks. And I think by game 1 against the Rams, Big Olu is going to end up starting at center for the Seahawks because they really don't have anything at center. They signed Evan Brown, a free agent from the Lions.
Former Giant.
Kind of more of a complimentary guy. Right, exactly. So Olu's going to have a shot to start at center. So what they've done with those rookies, getting them ahead of the curve by starting them for 17 weeks a year ago, hopefully will put them ahead of the game when the season kicks off against the Rams in week 1. But I like where the offensive line is at. They're still not where they need to be overall, but they're moving forward, which is a great, great sign for this young offensive line.
Well, similar to the Giants, they've drafted that position over the last few years, and now you're looking for that group to just simultaneously gain chemistry and grow up together. So I think there's a lot of similarities from that standpoint. You mentioned the focus was, okay, Geno hopefully will have a tremendous amount of support around him and he'll be able to maybe duplicate or elevate. And I think part of that goes to what he has within the receiving core. And Dave, I want to combine the receivers and the tight ends. They draft Jackson Smith-Njigba, who clearly was one of the top wide receivers coming out of Ohio State. He's coming off an injury, but we know what he could do when fully healthy. And then I think a group that gets overlooked is their massive unit of tight ends. I mean, they really maximize the depth at that position. How much do you think what they could get out of the tight ends again this year and the addition of Smith-Njigba adds even more weaponry to what Geno could tap into?
Yeah, I don't expect much from the tight ends. That's the one position where I was kind of hoping they would go out and upgrade and get a real difference maker, and they haven't done that. I mean, Colby Parkinson is okay. Will Disley is okay, but he's banged up a lot. Noah Fant they got in the Denver trade. The problem is a tight end in this system is really never going to be a big-time pass catcher. Not as long as Pete Carroll wants to run the football. He's basically an extra blocker. So I think when it comes to pass catchers, you've got your top 3, which are DK, Tyler Lockett, the rookie Jackson Smith-Njigba. Kenny Walker is going to catch balls out of the backfield. The rookie Zach Charbonnet from UCLA is going to catch balls out of the backfield. I'm not expecting much from this tight end group, but I am expecting a ton from Jackson Smith-Njigba. Guys, I'm telling you, you go back and look at Jackson Smith-Njigba's college numbers at Ohio State. If he would have been eligible for the draft after his second year in school, I think this guy would have been a top 10 pick in the NFL draft. but he goes out there and he blows his hamstring out, only plays in 3 games the entire season in 2022, and falls all the way to number 20. This is a guy that was the Gatorade State Player of the Year at the highest level of football in Texas, okay, at a football factory. He had 1,600 yards and 9 touchdowns as a sophomore at Ohio State. He's got everything you need in a wide receiver. I don't say this very often about wide receivers that come into the NFL, and I certainly don't say it about guys that play for the Seahawks, because as long as Pete Carroll's here, they're going to be a running team. I think Jackson Smith-Njigba is going to kill it from game number 1, and if you're looking for a fantasy guy to pop as a rookie in game 1, go with this kid.
Yeah, especially since they had Marquise Goodwin as their 3rd wide receiver last season. So it'll be very interesting to see what he can do in that role. We haven't talked about a trio of wideouts. I just wanted to follow up, Dave. The reason I brought up the tight ends is 9 touchdowns out of that group last year. So to your point, even though they may not have been prolific pass catchers, it seemed like Geno relied on them to finish drives, and they did flash at key components throughout the season.
Well, yeah, for sure. But again, you're not going to really look at that group and say there's one big-time difference maker superstar, right? I mean, Noah Fant's not scaring any defensive coordinators. Will Disley is not scaring any defensive coordinators. Colby Parkinson is not freaking anybody out. So there's no real big-time impact tight end on this football team, and that's fine. Again, maybe a guy like that could sneak down the seam when, Lockett, Metcalf, and Jackson Smith-Njigba are getting all the attention from defenses. So I still think your bread and butter, for the most part, is going to come from those 3 wide receivers and those 2 running backs. When it comes to skill players, that really is what's going to end up being the difference for this football team.
Softy, let's flop it to defense. I got to ask you mentioned Bobby Wagner earlier. The guy's a Seahawks legend. Now he comes back. I'm not sure what went into that decision or how much they want to lean on him and how much they think he has left. We know Jordan Brooks had the knee injury. That's a big deal because obviously the guy is an incredible tackling machine. And then I also saw that they signed Devin Bush, who totally flamed out as a bust with the Pittsburgh Steelers. But they must see something there, and maybe they're taking a flyer hoping he can reclaim some of the hype that he had when he came out of school.
Yeah, they gave him no money. He's on a 1-year prove-it contract. I mean, he's getting paid, I think $1 million and nothing. In 2023, by the 1 year, $3.5 million. So it's a nothing burger deal for the Seahawks. It's a prove-it contract. Really, in the end, the guy that the Seahawks want to see blow up this year is Jordan Brooks. He was a first-round draft pick out of Texas Tech 4 years ago. They declined his 5th-year option, guy, so he is set to become a free agent at the end of the season. So if he wants to get paid in 2024, he's got to perform, and what a great time for him to get Bobby Wagner back, because Jordan Brooks' best years came with Bobby Wagner playing next to him in Seattle. He takes off, Jordan Brooks kind of regresses, and now Bobby's back, and now Jordan Brooks can go back to playing a different position, maybe more on the outside versus the inside, and maybe get the numbers and get that contract he's looking for next season. But I think Bobby Wagner can still play. I mean, look, I know you guys look at PFF and Pro Football Focus.
No, not me, Softy.
No, Paul absolutely loves that website. Yes, Softy.
Not me, Softy.
Just hang on. Let me just say this. I don't agree with everything PFF says, okay? But I think that they do provide a little bit of a general guideline of how people perform from 1 year to the next. And they had Bobby Wagner as the top-rated linebacker in football last season. Now, does that mean he was the best? No. Does it mean maybe he was top 10, top 15, top 20? Hey, that's still pretty damn good for a guy at his age, and I think that's exactly what the Seahawks need. So I think Jordan Brooks is the guy that's going to benefit the most from Bobby Wagner coming back.
We're talking with Dave Softy Mahler, host on KJR Radio in Seattle, as we break down the Seahawks, who the Giants will host in Week 4. I look at this pass rushing unit, Dave, very much underrated. 2 guys in particular. We talk about Geno Smith on the offensive side of the ball. I don't know if Seattle has the season it did last year if they don't get what Uchenna Nwosu provided in his first year, which was a really nice pickup. He had a career year. And even Darrell Taylor, who I think took his production, even though maybe there were some mixed results over the course of the season. What is the stock within both of those guys as to whether or not the team believes that was a flash last season versus that's a building block of what they're going to do moving forward?
Right. So you remember Darrell Taylor missed his rookie year. He was banged up. So he's just kind of getting going and finally popped last year and had the 9.5 sacks. And Really, I think a guy that they need big time because they still are missing, I think, a really nice rotation there at edge rusher. Uchenna is more of an outside linebacker than he is a hands-on-the-ground defensive end type guy. They brought in Draymond Jones, obviously from Denver, as their big-time free agent signing. They re-signed Jaron Reed after being gone for a couple years. I don't know how much they can expect out of Jaron Reed on the interior. He had a couple of good seasons, actually popped a while back and had about, 9.5, 10 sacks one season for the Seahawks. But that was with Frank Clark playing next to him, and now Frank Clark is gone, obviously. So I still think they're a player light on the defensive front. I would have loved to have seen them go out in the draft and get one more guy. All of us were banging the drum for Jalen Carter at number 5, and they took Devin Witherspoon instead, and Carter went to the Eagles, obviously. We heard a lot of rumors, by the way, about why they didn't take Jalen Carter, most of which the guy shows up at the facility for his pre-draft workout and comes across as a cocky, arrogant SOB, and the Seahawks said thanks, but no thanks, and they moved on. So he falls to Philadelphia. Devin Witherspoon is the pick at number 5, the cornerback from Illinois, but I still think they're a guy light on the defensive front.
Softy, always been impressed with Seattle's special teams. They've got the kicker, they got the punter, they got the ability to cover. That's always the X factor. You know, Jeff Eagles would always tell us it's still a third of the game, and I agree with him. And Seattle can always pretty much count on having an edge in specials.
Well, they're gonna play it safe as long as Pete Carroll's here. They're gonna be conservative as long as Pete Carroll's here, and that drives a lot of fans nuts, guys, out here in Seattle. 4th and 5 from the opponent's 40-yard line or 45-yard line, whatever. And instead of going for it, they're punting, and they're trying to pin somebody deep and rely on their great defense. And that worked in 2013 and 2014 when the Hawks had the number 1 defense in the NFL. But when you don't have the number 1 defense in the NFL, you have to be a little more aggressive. So I think we're going to find out pretty early in the season, guys, what Pete Carroll makes of this defense. They should be better than they were a year ago. They went out and they spent a lot of capital, both money-wise and draft-wise, on that defense. Draymond Jones, Bobby Wagner, Devin Witherspoon, Jaron Reed are all here that were not here a year ago. So I think Pete Carroll is hoping to get back to that conservative type of football where they're winning games 17-10 or 21-14, where they can say, you know what, we don't need to chance it on 4th and 3 from the opposing 40-yard line, because we have a great defense and we have a great punter in Michael Dixon, who's been awesome ever since he showed up here. So I'm real curious to see how aggressive Pete Carroll gets, or does he just go back to his roots and play conservative with that great punter?
Dave, last one for me. You brought up Devin Witherspoon, who was their first-round pick, and you referenced back at 13 and 14 how good the defense was. I mean, I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but when you look at what Tariq Woolen did yet last year and Kobe Bryant, and now you add Witherspoon, I mean, you could be looking at the second installment of the Legion of Boom if those 3 guys grow together and play as well as the other 2 did their rookie year. I mean, that was some gem that they landed with Tariq Woolen last season.
Yeah, it sure was. He's playing on the right side. Witherspoon's going to play on the left side. I thought Tariq Woolen easily could have been the Rookie of the Year, guys, over Sauce Gardner in New York. I know what big Jet fans you guys are on that show over there, so I know that doesn't break your heart to hear that. But he was outstanding. I mean, Tariq Woolen was a 5th-round draft pick who had barely played football out of Texas San Antonio. And heck, guys, I remember being on the air during training camp last summer, and Tariq Woolen came on the show and basically said, be patient with me. I'm figuring this thing out, right? Give me a little bit of a break. And the guy goes out and kills it in 2023. So if that's the starting point for this guy, where is he going to be in 2 or 3 years from now? But, yeah, between him and Witherspoon, and look, guys, you draft a cornerback at number 5, you're asking for a shutdown corner. I mean, you don't take guys in the top 5 unless you think they're going to be superstar players. So Devin Witherspoon is a little bit undersized. His weight concerns me a little bit. We'll see what happens as the years go by. But he's a dog. You know, Brett Bielema was his coach at Illinois. We had him on the air and just said, look, this guy's looking to kill everybody, you know, at 5'10", 180 pounds. So I'm curious to see if he can survive physically in the NFL. But really the key for me for the secondary is what's happening at safety. Jamal Adams. Right. Is he going to even play? Is he going to even be available? Is he going to be on PUP? Is he going to miss the first 8 games of the year? There's a reason why they went out and got Julian Love in free agency, who played for you guys, obviously, in New York, because they don't know what Jamal Adams' status is. They feel very good about Quandre Diggs, at the other safety spot, but they don't have any idea what the hell's going on with Jamal Adams from day to day. So we talked to Pete Carroll about that over the offseason, and even he, the most optimistic SOB walking the face of the earth, can't guarantee that Jamal Adams is going to be ready for the opener against the Rams. So the Julian Love acquisition shows me that they've got some concerns about whether or not Jamal Adams can play the entire season.
Well, Love is a smart player. He knows what he's doing. He's versatile, a great teammate, great leader. You'll enjoy having him out there, Softy, for sure.
Yeah.
Now, the Giants are going to play Seattle in Week 4 here at the Meadowlands on October the 2nd. Seattle's beaten the Giants 3 in a row on visits here to the Meadowlands, so it ought to be very interesting as things progress. At Week 4, Softy, what is the biggest concern of which unit is going to have to come together? Is it the secondary that you just talked about at that early point in the season? Should the Giants be happy to be playing Seattle that early in the schedule?
Well, let me ask you this. Is Saquon Barkley playing in Week 4? Or is he sitting out?
He'll be there Week 1 against Dallas.
Okay.
Yeah, he'll be there.
Yeah, there you go. Well, my concern would be stopping the run, because that's the problem the Seahawks defense had a year ago. They could not stop anybody on the ground, okay? And they lost games specifically because of that weakness on the defensive side of the ball. So sometimes it takes the defense a little bit of time to gel up front when you have all those new guys there. They're veterans, so I'm not that concerned about it. But you know what? Look, guys, this football team, I think, is ready to go from week number 1. The idea that you're getting a break by playing them in week 4 versus week 16 or week 17, whatever, for this football team, I don't think it really matters. Again, they were a 9-8 football team last year, and they had a lot of reasons to not be that good, and they shocked the world. So I think this football team is going to be a contender in the NFC from week number 1. I just want Paul to come on the show before week 4 and trash Geno Smith again, because that would guarantee a Seahawks victory.
You know where to find me, Softy. I never run and hide. We ought to mention too. His listeners were so happy with that Seattle win over the Giants last year that they begged Softy to have me come back on.
Oh, after the game,
and I was there, wasn't I? I didn't duck it. I didn't duck it.
You're a man of your word. You came back on the show. But let me ask you guys a question, because I think, honestly, Daniel Jones has a lot of great traits as a quarterback. I think Daniel Jones is a really, really, really good player. Mm-hmm. I worry the Giants are not giving him enough talent to succeed. Am I crazy?
Not this year, Softy. They added to that receiver room, and of course Darren Waller is here now, and that offensive line has been enhanced. Come on now, I think you're going to see quite a Giants offense this year. I really do.
The receiving core, Dave, was also banged up last season. I mean, if you go back to that Giants-Seattle game, you didn't see what the Giants had in terms of that position, because just so many of those guys were in and out of the lineup. So I think if that unit stays healthy and what Darren Waller could bring to the table, I think you're working with much more substantive talent than what you saw up close and personal last season.
Yep.
All right, okay, because I'm looking at Darius Slayton, Isaiah Hodgins, Sterling Shepard, Jalen Hyatt, the rookie. I mean, who should I really be concerned about? Who's the guy that would be better than Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, or Jackson Smith and Jigba?
Well, I don't know if I'd go that far. I mean, Lockett and Metcalf, you're talking about proven veterans who have done it year in and year out. I think to say somebody on the Giants is going to match that level, we may be getting a little bit ahead of ourselves.
We should just go right to the tight end spot, where Darren Waller is going to have better numbers than the entire tight ends on the Seahawks roster.
Waller is probably going to be the Kelsey of the Giants, in fairness, Dave. I mean, that's the best way to look at it. But I will give you one guy, if he could stay healthy, that I'm high on, who you didn't mention, is Wan'Dale Robinson.
What about Paris Campbell?
Well, Paris Campbell they brought in from the Indianapolis Colts, but Robinson was a rookie out of Kentucky who had a really good game against the Lions, and then he unfortunately got hurt. So I think if he could stay healthy, he could be one of those guys that's elusive and maybe present some explosive plays.
Is this, by the way, is this a father-son show? You guys sound just like each other.
I don't know about that. You may be the first individual that has ever said that, Dave.
My God.
Oh.
I didn't know that Paul was allowed to procreate, to be honest with you.
No, hey, Softy, the world can only take one of me.
Yeah, there are no family ties or genes, I can assure you, okay? The Meadows and the Dottinos are on opposite ends of the spectrum. I'm glad to report. Yes.
Be well, my friend. Thanks for coming on today.
Appreciate it. Yep. Thanks for the time.
All right, guys. We'll talk soon. Bye.
Be good.
You got it. That is Dave Softy Mahler from KJR Radio in Seattle. Okay, so you went back on the show.
Yes.
After being critical of Geno Smith.
And
Okay.
I explained how Smith played the game of his life. He was as accurate can be.
The entire season he was accurate.
But that game in particular, he was like an officer in the firing range. I mean,
especially deep down the field.
It was incredible how accurate he was. And on the flip side, the Giants were playing with the banged up offensive line. They had the special teams miscues, which proved incredibly fatal. And, as far as I'm concerned, that game was not maybe as lopsided as the score indicated. And so I went back on the next day. Softy called me, goes, "Are you willing to come back on?" I said, "Sure. I got nothing to hide. I know exactly why the Giants lost the game. I'm not going to hide from it. I don't run from it. Everybody on this program knows I'm 41 years doing this. I'm not going anywhere." So, I'd be very glad to go back on with them again.
Well, Geno, he had a career year in terms of completion percentage. You're talking about an individual that led the NFL. It wasn't just that Giants game. I would argue it was pretty much the entire season. And I was actually looking over some numbers just preparing for our talk with Dave. And Geno actually had, I think this was a stat courtesy of Pro Football Focus, 35 big throws, which is what they describe. And that means that the completion percentage was not just a product, Paul, of him just dumping it off to the running backs. He took opportunities down the field to Metcalf and Lockett last season.
Well, doesn't this go back to the theory that we talk about all the time, that Daniel Jones has the ability to make those big throws, but he did not have the receivers or the time to necessarily do it?
Two-way stream.
Well, now, again, the Seahawks line was young and inexperienced last year, and Geno did face a lot of pressure. But he did have a really strong running game, and he really had some terrific skill positions in the passing game that allowed him to make those throws and to complete them on the other end of those passes.
Absolutely.
I say it all the time. Daniel Jones can make a bunch of really nice throws, but if the Giants' receiving core isn't going to make plays for him on the other side, it's going to look poorly on Daniel, and that's not his fault.
Well, you need the weapons. There's no doubt about that.
Can somebody get open, and can somebody make 50-50 ball catches? And this unit this year should be able to do that.
And once again, I think that's dependent on the guys that we're talking about are all on the field. I mean, we can't predict the injury bug. You just don't know. And we talked about Mahler has been in and out of the lineup the last 2 seasons. If those guys stay healthy, it's not going to be a question about whether or not Daniel Jones has the talent, but it's just a matter of can he rely on those guys week in and week out? Because I'm bringing up the Seahawks-Giants box score, and it was a relatively low-scoring game until the Seahawks pulled away and got that explosive touchdown to Lockett, remember? And then Walker scored the touchdown on the shortened field.
2 special teams miscues in the
return
return
doubt about
game.
It. So in terms of the receiving core, remember, there was no Isaiah Hodgins at that point in the season, just to keep things in mind. You had Wan'Dale Robinson had been in and out of the lineup. Then he got hurt shortly after the bye week with the Lions game. Bellinger was hurt because of the eye injury. The leading receiver was Darius Slayton. Right behind him was Tanner Hudson. And then it was Wan'Dale Robinson. Let's face it, it wasn't a good passing game overall.
And I believe Tyree Phillips started at tackle on the offensive line.
Yeah, based on the box score, you may be right. They don't give you what happened with respect to the offensive line. But that sounds about right, that could be.
Again, people can talk about excuses, but there are reasons. If you go back and you watch that game, it's obvious what happened and why Seattle won the game. It was a nip-and-tuck game until the miscue there late, which then allowed them to blow the game open and put the game out of reach. But, it was a miserable day in Seattle. I remember it very well. I was on the field. Miserable, miserable day in Seattle, as it usually is. And we all know that we could talk about all the circumstances we want, but it happens to be true. They do have a great home field advantage. Pete Carroll, I think, in his career has won well over 70% of his games in Seattle.
Oh, they call it the 12th man for a reason.
And it really is unbelievable there. That, to me, is between Seattle and the New Orleans Superdome. Those are the 2 places, if I'm the New York Giants, that I really don't look forward to going to, because there have been so many bad things, nightmare-type days that have happened in the New Orleans Superdome and Seattle. Those two buildings, I cringe when I think about going to those buildings.
I'm trying to bring up here to see whether or not
the link hasn't exactly been a whole lot of fun either.
No, well, there's a lot of places you could point to. Even Kansas City Arrowhead Stadium is not necessarily a kind place. I'm not saying for the Giants in particular, but other teams can relate to that too. Phillips did start against the Seahawks, which was the Week 8 game. So that was the case of that department. There are two things that I think stood out to me about that game. Seahawks dominated in the trenches. I mean, they had 5 sacks in that game. They beat up the Giants up front, and they also did a really good job, and this is a reflection of the offensive line. They took away the run game. Daniel Jones had to make plays through the air. The Giants, they averaged just under 3 yards per carry in that game.
And his incredibly limited receiving core did not do him any favors.
Yeah, well, that's why I pointed out who was available and who wasn't. So it's all relevant, but the bottom line is, even if they had the weaponry, you still can't overlook the fact that that game was decided in the trenches. So the Giants, they're going to be tested again by the Seattle front because the core is coming back again. But as you were talking about earlier, when we were talking about X factors, you mentioned maybe the offensive line makes a case to be in that X factor department this season.
It's funny because even though there are things that we've just pointed to that clearly had an impact on the game, if the Giants don't have those two special teams miscues in the return game, which really tilted the field significantly, I still wonder if that game might not have been nip and tuck down to the very end.
Well, it's possible. It may have been a little bit more competitive down the stretch. I'll give you that.
It just really turned the game into a whitewash.
It did, and that's why we talk about all three facets on this show.
Exactly.
Not just necessarily offense and defense.
And
again, coverage. It's not just the return game. It's the coverage unit, too.
It's special teams. Yeah. It is a third of the game. Some people still don't want to believe that. It is a big part of it.
Few reminders before we wrap up shop here. You can check out the Giants Huddle podcast. You go to giants.com/podcast or your favorite podcast platform as we are preparing and previewing for the 2023 NFL schedule. Well, it's officially out. Single game tickets are on sale now. Don't miss the Giants at MetLife Stadium this season. You can visit giants.com/tickets to secure your seat, and you can take your fandom to the next level with a Giants season ticket membership. Stay connected to the club all year round, not just on game days. Memberships are now available for the 2023 season. To learn more about all the exclusive member benefits, visit giants.com/tickets. Limited inventory is available. And the Giants official connected TV streaming app, it's Giants TV. It brings you original video content and game highlights on demand and direct to Big Blue fans. Giants TV, it's free. It's on Apple TV, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, as well as the Giants mobile app. So a few reminders as we close up the show here on Giants.com. Big Blue Kickoff Live. We'll continue our opponent preview series the rest of the week. Tomorrow is the New York Jets, and then we will start to tackle a few other upcoming opponents, so stay tuned for that. For Paul Dottino, I'm Lance Medow. As we move forward here on another week of programming, a reminder that today's episode is part of the Giants platforms everywhere and giants.com/podcast. We'll be back up and running again on Tuesday, and you can stay locked to giants.com for all the latest. Have a good one.